He slammed the gavel before Jasmine Crockett could finish the first sentence that left her lips. Her voice halted mid-word, and for an instant, the entire Senate hearing room seemed to hold its breath. The fluorescent lights droned overhead, their static hum now impossibly loud in the hush that had fallen. Eyes snapped to the dais, where the committee chair, an austere presence in a crisp suit, leaned forward with a severity that felt more like a warning than a gesture of respect. Jasmine, her composure momentarily shaken, swallowed hard. She could feel the tension coiling around her like an invisible tether, restraining her from speaking out of turn again, though every fiber of her being wanted to push back. On the far side, staffers exchanged glances, uncertain whether to step in or wait for instructions. Not a single whisper was heard among the silent crowd of observers, journalists, and other officials lining the walls. A single shaky exhalation from somewhere at the back reminded them that time still moved, but it felt as though the very air had solidified into something thick and oppressive. In that cavernous silence, Jasmine set her jaw and decided that being silenced once would not make her quiet forever. She was used to this, though she loathed it. Time and again, Jasmine had walked into rooms dominated by power, only to find her voice labeled as disruptive or inconvenient. But her cause, her fiercely guarded moral code, demanded that she stand in that hearing room and say what needed to be said. In her mind, the moral decay of authority that stifled truth was precisely why she was here. She gripped the edges of the small microphone stand, fingertips pressing against the metal, remembering the countless phone calls and emails that had begged her to speak up. This was not just for her. It was for the unheard. The old feelings of righteous anger mixed with a measured calm she had carefully honed over the years. She let the hush linger a few seconds longer, letting the tension settle like dust on antique furniture, a dust that was about to be disturbed. The chair cleared his throat, tilting his head to the side as though he were dealing with a child who had broken a rule. "Ms. Crockett, you will wait until you're recognized. This hearing has rules." His voice held the same dryness as the starched collar around his neck, and it prickled every nerve in Jasmine's body. She thought of the stories she had collected, families denied justice, a system that played favorites, and the insidious way power shaped every narrative that threatened its comfort. She inhaled slowly, keeping her own voice steady when she finally answered. "Understood." It was a small word, measured, devoid of panic, precisely the reaction that was expected and the reaction she refused to let define her stance. She would play by the rules, but only to prove they had been rigged from the start. Journalists scribbled notes, capturing the standoff in real time. The motionless cameras in the back of the room winked their red recording lights, their presence a silent witness that these moments would not be confined to the ephemeral space of this hearing. A hush inched through the crowd again as everyone waited to see what she would do next. A bead of sweat trailed down the side of Jasmine's face, not from fear but from the sheer heat of the lights overhead and the intensity of what this moment meant. She thought of all those eyes, expecting her to break, to lash out, to confirm the narrative that a fiery voice had no place in a calm institutional setting. Instead, she remained poised. Finally, the chair gestured for her to begin again. A polite nod, but the condescension radiated from him, as though simply allowing her a moment to speak was some grand benevolence. Jasmine inhaled, reminded herself of the supporters who had placed their faith in her to speak. She had spent sleepless nights preparing statements, gathering evidence, weaving it all into a coherent, undeniable argument. As she started to speak, her voice rang with a clarity that sliced through the stale air. "There are individuals who have been left unheard, individuals whose lives have been systematically discredited." She scanned the dais of senators seated in raised chairs, her eyes finding each in turn, as though daring them to dismiss her words. "And it is my duty, our duty, to ensure that their voices reach this chamber." The tension was thick enough to make even the robust overhead lights flicker, or so it felt. The next interruption came from the far left of the dais. A senator in a charcoal suit, features set in a stern frown, spoke with a bored disinterest. "We must keep this hearing on track, Ms. Crockett. We're not here for emotional appeals." His gaze was unflinching, and there was no warmth in his expression. Jasmine recognized the tactic, dismissed the speaker as emotional, thereby disqualifying the substance of their claims. She knew it well. She also knew the right response was calm and factual, though every ounce of her wanted to let the same cold cynicism color her words. But she refused to stoop to that level. "Emotions guide us to truth sometimes," she replied with forced composure, smoothing the lapel of her jacket. "Facts are the structure, but without the emotional drive to seek justice, we lose sight of why the facts matter. My statement is based on extensive data, interviews, and recorded incidents of systematic dismissal of grievances." She paused, letting the seriousness set in. "I'll present the facts, Senator, in their raw form. And I trust this committee will let them stand on their own merit." The senator gave a curt nod, but there was a flicker of disdain in his eyes. A faint rustle of shifting bodies moved through the crowd. Jasmine's supporters, mostly silent observers behind her, remained stoic. A few journalists tapped on their phones, already disseminating tidbits of the confrontation in real time. She had been here before, in 1,000 smaller hearing rooms, community centers, local offices. She was no stranger to pushback. But this hearing, with its national spotlight, felt like an entirely different beast. The stakes soared above her head like a giant hawk, poised to dive at any moment. Jasmine steeled herself and began her presentation in earnest. She spoke calmly, detailing case after case of individuals who had come forward with allegations of abuse, misconduct, or the systematic silencing of legitimate concerns. Each story was more heart-wrenching than the last, yet Jasmine kept her voice measured, each word meticulously chosen. The chair watched her intently. His fingers tapped a slow, rhythmic pattern against the table, as though biding his time for the moment to swoop in and disrupt her narrative. But for now, he let her speak. The entire hearing felt suspended in that singular breath of tension. Eventually, she reached a series of statements that directly implicated the committee's oversight processes, or lack thereof. At the mention of these failings, the chair's tapping stopped. He leaned forward, clearing his throat. "Ms. Crockett," he said, voice low but unmistakably edged, "I would caution you not to leap to conclusions without evidence." She offered a faint, polite smile. "I have the evidence here. Compiled depositions, corroborated recordings, and sworn affidavits. If you permit me, I'll walk the committee through each relevant piece." Her matter-of-fact tone left the chair with little room to object without appearing dismissive. Once again, he signaled her to continue. She breathed out a quiet relief that he had not cut her off, though she knew this reprieve could evaporate at the slightest provocation. One by one, she introduced the cases, described how official records had vanished or been altered, how voices were hushed the moment they threatened the status quo. She had a precise detail, a signature on a letter that was never supposed to exist, hinting at deep-seated corruption. The room was deathly still, except for her voice. Occasionally, one of the senators would shift in their seat or murmur to a colleague. But mostly, they listened, some with skepticism, others with forced politeness, and a few with genuine concern. This uneasy dynamic was exactly what Jasmine had anticipated. Near the back of the room, an older woman pressed her lips together as she heard mention of her nephew's case, a young man whose complaint had been buried in bureaucratic red tape for over 2 years. The heartbreak in that silent expression became a galvanizing force for Jasmine. She would not be silenced. She would not be told her words carried no weight. At length, Jasmine stopped speaking, the final line of her presentation echoing in the microphone for a moment. She realized she was holding her breath. Carefully, she exhaled, letting the energy she had built up escape in a measured flow. The silence that followed felt like a drawn bowstring, taut and ready to release an arrow. Then the chair spoke in that same condescending monotone. "Thank you, Ms. Crockett, for your extensive summary. We'll move on to the next item on the agenda." And in that instant, it was clear he intended to brush aside everything she had just shared. The tension soared again. She blinked, refusing to accept that. Even though he technically had the procedural authority to transition to another topic, the moral authority belonged with the truth she had spoken. "Mr. Chair, before we move on, the committee has a duty to address what I've just presented." she interjected, voice surprisingly calm, betraying none of the fury boiling inside. He half rose from his seat, gaze flicking toward the security staff as if to gauge whether he should forcibly end her time. Instead, he remained rigidly in place, jaw clenched. "Miss Crockett, your time is concluded," he stated with cold finality. There it was again, the attempt to stifle her. But this time, something snapped in the atmosphere of that hearing room. Jasmine pressed her palms flat on the table in front of her. The dryness in her mouth tasted like metal. She forced her voice to remain even, but the reverberation in her heart thrummed like a thunderstorm. "Respectfully, sir, I have not been given the courtesy of a single question, or even a moment to clarify the seriousness of these claims." She let her gaze travel the line of senators. "If you believe in the integrity of this institution, if any of you do, you will hear these witnesses. You will demand these records be entered into the official record of this hearing." The chair's lips thinned, but he said nothing. For a heartbeat, no one did. Then, from somewhere on the dais, a different senator, one with gray hair and an expression of cautious sympathy, spoke up. "I move that we table the next agenda item briefly so Ms. Crockett can finish her statement." Heads turned. It was a modest gesture, but in that small act, Jasmine found a crack in the fortress that threatened to bury the truth. The chair seemed to weigh his options, clearly displeased, but the eyes of the room were on him. If he shut her down now, it would be an explicit refusal to hear evidence. He glanced at the clock, then down at the paperwork in front of him. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "But keep it brief." That concession was all the spark needed to reignite hope. Jasmine nodded at the supportive senator before gathering her notes. She was far from finished, though a new weight pressed on her. This might be her last chance to speak without being forcibly removed. She intended to use every moment wisely. Her eyes flicked down to the lines of carefully composed words she had spent long hours perfecting. Each line felt like a coil of compressed energy, ready to spring forward into the open air. She had to proceed carefully, balancing facts with urgency, passion with composure. This hearing was teetering on the edge of collapse into chaotic outbursts. One misstep, and the narrative she had built could be swept away in a torrent of condemnation. She lifted her gaze to the dais again, and though her pulse pounded, her voice came steady. "To the members of this committee, and to those who have gathered today seeking truth, I present the following testimony, not as a personal vendetta but as a moral imperative. We cannot allow the quiet silencing of legitimate concerns to continue. It is not only unethical, it is a direct threat to the very foundation of our democracy." She paused, letting the final word resonate, because democracy was something these senators professed to uphold. Now, each would show whether they cherished it enough to confront uncomfortable realities. A phone chimed softly in the back, and a staffer frantically silenced it. All eyes remained fixed on Jasmine. She continued detailing a new piece of evidence, a voice recording from a closed-door meeting that contradicted official statements. "On this tape," she said carefully, "we hear a clear admission of wrongdoing. We have verified the identity of the speaker and matched it to the timeline of events." Before she could continue, the condescending senator interjected. "That recording was obtained illegally, was it not?" His question came off as a well-aimed arrow at her credibility. She had expected this challenge. The individual who made it was a participant in the meeting and recorded it on their device, which is permissible under our state's all-party consent rules, given that they were physically present. We have legal counsel who vetted it." The senator had no immediate rebuttal, but his expression remained hardened. Jasmine then methodically described the content of the recording, an explicit conversation about instructing staffers to alter certain logs that would otherwise confirm the testimonies of those individuals Jasmine represented. In simpler terms, it was a discussion about a cover-up. The crowd stirred. A low murmur rippled through the audience as the weight of these revelations began to dawn on them. If her claims were true, this was not just a matter of ignoring complaints, it was active sabotage of justice. The chair looked restless, hands fidgeting with the stack of papers. "Miss Crockett, we have protocols for entering evidence," he said. But before he could finish, she replied with unwavering calm. I've already filed it with the clerk for your review. He paused, presumably not having expected her thoroughness. Sensing her advantage, Jasmine pressed on. This conversation lays bare the willingness of certain officials to manipulate official records to protect those in power. We have reason to believe it's part of a broader pattern. She scanned the dais again, noticing a glimmer of discomfort on more than one face. Some likely recognized the truth in her statement. Others saw a political headache that could tarnish their carefully maintained public image. She continued, I'm not here to paint everyone with the same brush. There are honorable leaders among you. But if you remain silent in the face of this, if you dismiss these claims without due diligence, then you become part of the problem. That line hung in the air, a direct moral appeal that threatened no physical consequences but carried moral weight. A few uneasy coughs broke the silence, but no one spoke. Jasmine inhaled, preparing to move forward with her final piece of evidence, a set of emails that contradicted a key senator's public statements, when the chair once again cut in. Ms. Crockett, he began in a tighter voice than before. We are far beyond the time allotted. If we need further information, we will subpoena witnesses or documents as necessary. But we must remain orderly and keep to protocol. Jasmine recognized the tactic again, hide behind formality to maintain control. But she was not done. Mr. Chair, the system of checks and balances is rendered meaningless if we're not willing to open our eyes to these manipulations, she said. Her voice now trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the raw intensity of the truths she was laying bare. I've delivered the testimonies, the documents, the recordings. I've done everything according to procedure. I've come here seeking accountability, not chaos. The chair regarded her coolly, then cast a glance around at the other committee members as if searching for someone to come to his defense. Some avoided his gaze, possibly uneasy with how brazenly he was dismissing her. Others maintained their stoic composure, hoping the tension would dissipate without them having to wade into the fray. Sensing no immediate rescue, he turned back to Jasmine. Your official statement has been received. That's where we will leave it for now, he declared, voice edged with finality. The gavel teetered in his hand, close to coming down again. Jasmine's lungs burned for air, the adrenaline surging. She thought of the countless people who had pinned their hope on her testimony being heard and properly addressed. She had come so far, only to have her words brushed aside in a swirl of bureaucratic maneuvering. But she refused to crumble under the authorities' weight. She dared to lean forward, softly resting her fingertips on the microphone one last time, focusing on what she had to say next as though her life depended on it. Before you strike that gavel, I ask you to remember that real people are affected by this. I've laid out enough evidence to demand at least an inquiry, if not immediate action. If you turn away now, the public will see it. And they will not forget, she said softly, her words almost a whisper, but amplified by the microphone and heavy with significance. The silence that followed was absolute. The chair's eyes burned into hers, brimming with contempt for this woman who dared to challenge his authority so openly. But something in her unwavering gaze gave him pause. For a moment, no one moved. Then, in one abrupt motion, he rapped the gavel on the wooden block. It was not a thunderous strike, but a crisp, measured sound, like a final punctuation mark. We are adjourning for a brief recess, he announced. We will reconvene in 15 minutes. Everyone seemed to breathe again. Murmurs erupted. Staffers stood and hustled out to confirm details or to avoid the tension. Cameras panned away, capturing glimpses of the scene. Meanwhile, Jasmine remained seated, the papers spread before her like a battlefield of facts, uncertain if she had won a small victory or simply delayed defeat. In the swirl of bodies exiting, a few journalists hurried over, hoping to catch a quote from her. She offered them a polite smile but gestured that she needed a moment. Her heart raced, her temples pulsing with the aftershock of standing her ground against such resistance. And then, in that moment of relative quiet, before the next wave of conflict inevitably arrived, she felt it, a small surge of validation. The hearing might have been suspended, but her voice had not been lost. She suspected the real battle would begin as soon as they reconvened, possibly behind closed doors. But for now, she let the relief wash over her, if only for a few steadying breaths. She organized her thoughts, preparing for what was likely to come next. She knew that beyond the Senate chamber doors, the public was already buzzing about the confrontation. The viral nature of these events could create unstoppable momentum if harnessed correctly. She resolved to keep pushing forward, no matter how the leadership tried to muzzle her. In the back of her mind, she played out the next scenario. Maybe they'd come after her credibility with some spurious allegation. Maybe they'd bar her from the next hearing. She took one more measured breath, her nerves finally settling into an uneasy calm. Whatever they tried, it wouldn't make her back down. When the recess ended, the crowd filtered in again, filling the seats with murmurs and side glances. The chair returned, flanked by a few loyal senators who wore stern expressions. Whatever had happened in the corridor or in the offices beyond had hardened the resolve of those who wanted her silent. She noted, with a slight twist in her stomach, that the supportive senator from earlier had a guarded look now, as though he'd been warned to back off. The chair banged the gavel. "We will resume. Our next order of business is scheduled testimony from." He named another person, effectively sidelining Jasmine's concerns and shoving them to the periphery. But she was not leaving yet. She sat in the row designated for participants who had already testified, scanning the faces of the officials on the dais, quietly documenting their every reaction as the hearing progressed into banal administrative updates. It struck her how quickly the institution sought to pivot away from uncomfortable truths. She heard the bored drone of official reports, the usual routine of lawmakers commending themselves for trivial achievements. The sense of unreality gnawed at her. Minutes earlier, the room had been a crucible of moral confrontation, and now it was as though a curtain had been drawn over the entire spectacle. Journalists occasionally glanced at her, cameras took in her stoic profile. She refused to leave even when a staffer discreetly suggested that she might be more comfortable waiting in the lobby. Instead, she remained, an unspoken reminder that her words weren't going away. A few seats away, an older man removed his hat respectfully and nodded at her, as though silently saying, "Keep going." The hearing slogged on. The dryness of legislative procedure hung in the air, thick as a dust cloud. Eventually, just as the chair was about to conclude the day's session, a senator spoke up. It was the same one who had previously given Jasmine a lifeline. He cleared his throat, glancing between Jasmine and the chair. "Mr. Chair, before we adjourn, I think it would be prudent to consider Ms. Crockett's evidence. At least to acknowledge that the committee has in its possession potentially significant documentation." There was a hush again. The chair's eyes narrowed, but the senator persisted. "We can't in good conscience pretend that none of that happened. And if we don't address it here, the public will expect an explanation as to why not." Jasmine's pulse quickened. She could feel the tide shifting, if only a fraction. The chair looked down at his notes, with an expression of exasperation. "The committee will review the material in due time," he said flatly. "For now, we must conclude." And again that gavel loomed. But the senator pressed on. "We have the time to at least schedule a follow-up hearing or a subcommittee review, do we not? The public interest is high." A ripple of agreement flitted through the audience. Even if the senator's peers remained largely silent, the tension was palpable. The chair hesitated, obviously loath to appear dismissive but equally determined not to cede control. Finally, he spoke in clipped tones. "Very well. The committee will consider scheduling a secondary session to address these claims, pending a preliminary internal review." His statement was as non-committal as possible, but it was more than Jasmine had expected. It was a door, if only slightly ajar. She felt an unexpected wave of gratitude toward the senator who had forced that small opening. Then, with a firm finality, the chair struck the gavel. The hearing was adjourned. In the commotion that followed, people rose from their seats, filing out into the corridor. Cameras swarmed around the chair, some angled toward Jasmine, who remained in her seat for a moment longer, mentally replaying every moment to see if she could have done more. But she reminded herself that sometimes, just staying in the fight was enough. She gathered her notes, carefully placing them in a worn leather folder. As she stood, A handful of journalists rushed over, clamoring for comment. One of them thrust a microphone forward, the harsh overhead lights reflecting off the metal. "Ms. Crockett, can you tell us what your next steps are? How do you respond to the chair's decision?" She looked directly into the lens of one of the cameras, momentarily seeing not just an inanimate device but an entire nation watching through that narrow portal. She answered calmly, "I came here to speak for those who had no platform. I believe I've done that. Whether this committee chooses to act or not is on them, but they cannot pretend they never heard these claims now." Another reporter piped in, "Do you feel today's hearing was fair?" Jasmine let a short, sardonic chuckle escape. "I think fairness is determined by action, not polite gestures. I'm hoping the committee understands that the public expects more than hollow procedure. They want the truth." More microphones were shoved in her face, but she needed space. She excused herself politely, stepping aside to let others pass, searching for a moment of quiet amid the churning crowd. Outside the hearing room, she found a corridor less crowded, though staffers and officials still buzzed around like unsettled bees. Leaning against a marble pillar, she closed her eyes for a brief moment of introspection. She recalled the thousands of messages she'd received before this day, each from someone who trusted she could make a difference. In the hush of that hallway, with the echo of footsteps around her, she reaffirmed her vow to see this through. Even if the system was determined to silence her, the momentum she generated might be unstoppable if the stories of injustice found an eager public ready to demand answers. She was startled from her thoughts by a gentle tap on the shoulder. Turning, she saw the same older woman who had quietly shed tears in the hearing room. The lines on her face spoke of loss and perseverance. Her voice was soft but resolute. "Thank you for mentioning my nephew's case." Instantly, Jasmine recognized her. "I'm so sorry for what you and your family have gone through," she replied gently. The woman gave a faint smile, watery eyes brimming with gratitude. "At least now, more people will know. He's not alone in this fight." Jasmine placed a reassuring hand on the woman's arm, feeling the gravity of what she had taken on. In these small moments, the scale of her responsibility felt immense. Word was traveling fast that Jasmine Crockett was the central figure in a confrontation with the Senate committee. Already, social media posts circulated, short clips of the chair silencing her or her calmly but passionately listing evidence. Her name was trending, with countless individuals cheering her courage and a chorus of skeptics calling her grandstanding. That was the nature of public discourse these days, polarizing, immediate, and relentless. The question now was how she would navigate this new wave of attention. She had no illusions that the battle was won. In fact, she suspected the chair and his allies were already forging their counterattack, discrediting her sources, questioning her integrity, or labeling her an extremist. She could almost hear the rehearsed talking points forming in their offices. But she reminded herself that sunlight was the best disinfectant. If the public had seen even a fraction of what she presented, if they started asking their own questions, the committee would face a rising tide of scrutiny that no parliamentary maneuver could fully quell. She lingered in the hallway, exchanging a few more hushed words with supporters and members of the press. Then, upon stepping outside the government building, she was met with a mild uproar. Protesters and supporters had gathered, forming a chaotic scene of signs, chanting, and media cameras. Some called her name, others demanded transparency from the Senate. It was a swirling mass of energy, fueled by the day's tension. She navigated through it carefully, acknowledging the supportive voices, ignoring the occasional sneer from a counter-protester. She did not want to be seen as rallying the crowd to storm the building. Instead, she quietly conveyed her appreciation for their presence. Their mere willingness to show up spoke volumes about the collective dissatisfaction simmering beneath the surface of public discourse. Once past the throng of people, she found relative quiet near a row of parked cars. A slight breeze ruffled her jacket, providing a momentary reprieve from the heat of the day. She checked her phone. It was flooded with messages, some from well-wishers, some from media outlets requesting interviews, and a handful from individuals who had entrusted her with their stories, each one saying they were proud to see those stories finally on such a public stage. Her heart felt simultaneously heavy and uplifted. So many people depended on her ability to keep pushing. Suddenly, her phone lit up with a call from an unknown number. Normally, she might ignore such a call, but instinct told her to answer. The voice on the other end was low and urgent, belonging to someone who claimed to have even more evidence about the cover-ups she had exposed. "I have documentation that ties these altered logs directly to one of the committee's top aides," the caller said. "But I'm afraid to go public." Jasmine felt a surge of adrenaline. This might be the missing link that could turn speculation into direct accountability. She urged the caller to remain calm and promised to set up a confidential meeting where they could safely share what they had. She jotted down notes on a scrap of paper, hands trembling slightly with the weight of what might be revealed. If even half of what the caller claimed was true, it would confirm that the corruption extended higher up than many suspected. When the call ended, she breathed in the crisp outside air, letting the breeze ground her. The day's events were spiraling into a bigger narrative, one she was determined to shape with truth and integrity. It was no longer just about the hearing. It was about a system that had bred complacency and corruption, using formality and procedure as shields. She realized with clarity that her next steps would involve not just testifying but constructing an ironclad case that no committee chair could sweep aside. And that meant forging alliances with those inside the system who still cared about justice, and rallying public support so that silence was no longer an option. She found her car, slid into the driver's seat, and just sat for a moment, letting the tension drain from her muscles. The seat felt like a sanctuary of sorts, a private space amid the turmoil. Closing her eyes, she replayed the hearing, considering every interruption, every moment of friction. What if she had answered differently at some point? Would it have changed anything? Probably not. The chair had set his mind on dismissing her from the start. But the unstoppable nature of truth was that once it was out in the open, it couldn't easily be forced back into the shadows. She took comfort in that, reminding herself that she had accomplished the hardest part, pulling back the curtain on wrongdoing, forcing those in power to confront it. Starting the car, she was momentarily startled by the voice of a talk radio host emanating from the speakers. She recognized the station. It was known for its coverage of political controversies. They were discussing her testimony, playing snippets of audio from the hearing. Jasmine Crockett, overshadowed by procedural drama, managed to make quite a statement today, the host said. The recapped quotes sent a shiver of validation down her spine. This was how it would spread. Through the unstoppable wave of information, public discourse, and moral outrage. She turned the volume down, but not off. She wanted to hear the entire conversation, to gauge how the narrative was already unfolding in the public sphere. On the drive back to her modest office, she navigated heavy traffic with mechanical precision, lost in thought about the next steps, verifying the new evidence from the anonymous call, coordinating with sympathetic senators, and shoring up her legal counsel for the inevitable blowback. Once at her office, a handful of volunteers and staff greeted her anxiously. They had been watching the live feed of the hearing. Their faces lit up with relief the moment she walked in, unharmed, though visibly drained. One of them, Naomi, a soft-spoken but stalwart aide, handed her a cup of lukewarm coffee. "We tried to keep it hot, but we weren't sure when you'd be back," Naomi said with an apologetic smile. Jasmine returned the smile, grateful for the gesture. Even the smallest comforts felt magnified under the day's strain. She spent the evening in a whirlwind of activity. She wrote a concise summary of the hearing, addressed immediate questions from local reporters, and fielded phone calls from community members who were invigorated by her show of defiance. Time moved in a strange way. It felt both glacial and impossibly fast. As the clock neared midnight, the office was still buzzing with the electricity of what had transpired, but eventually, staffers began to trickle out, heading home to rest. Jasmine urged them to get some sleep, knowing tomorrow promised new challenges. Only Naomi remained, determined to ensure that everything was in order for the potential meeting with the anonymous source. Together, they reviewed security protocols, phone encryption methods, and discreet meeting places. Finally, at around 2 in the morning, Jasmine found herself alone, the overhead lights dim. She stared at her reflection in the darkened window, seeing the fatigue in her eyes. She wondered if she had the stamina to keep pushing day after day, hearing after hearing. But then she recalled the faces of those who had entrusted her with their stories. The older woman at the hearing, the countless phone calls, emails, and heartbreaking tales of injustice. That weight was her motivation. It fueled her anger at the system and her resolve to see it reformed. She left the office, stepping out into the quiet night, the street lamps casting pale halos on the pavement. Despite her weariness, she felt an undercurrent of determination thrumming in her veins. There was no going back. The following days were an avalanche. News programs replayed her confrontation with the chair. On social media, her unwavering stand was dissected, praised, and sometimes mocked by those who saw her as an agitator. Some labeled her a hero for speaking truth to power, others accused her of grandstanding for personal gain. She tried to ignore the vitriol, focusing on the fact that many more eyes were on the issue of systemic silencing. That was progress. Late one afternoon, she received a message from the supportive senator, the one who had given her extra time. He suggested a private meeting, away from the prying eyes of the press, to discuss possible ways to force the committee to hold a formal inquiry. Jasmine felt a rush of cautious optimism. She agreed to meet him at a discreet corner cafe. On the day of the meeting, she arrived early, taking a seat at a quiet table in the back. The senator showed up, looking somewhat uneasy. He greeted her with a polite nod, ordered a black coffee, and slid into the seat across from her. He began by commending her bravery in the hearing. Then, lowering his voice, he confessed he'd felt pressured by certain colleagues to toe the line and dismiss her allegations. But he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was truth to her claims. As they spoke, Jasmine laid out the key points of her evidence, outlining how the committee had systematically avoided investigating several glaring discrepancies. The senator listened intently, his brow furrowing at intervals. "I think we can push for a subcommittee dedicated to examining these accusations," he offered. But the chair wields significant influence. If he feels threatened, he'll pull every lever to derail us. Jasmine nodded, understanding the political landscape better each day. "I know. That's why public support is vital. I'm hoping the outcry will make it impossible for him to hide these issues." The senator agreed, then checked his watch. He was cautious about being seen in a private meeting with her for too long. "Keep me informed about new evidence," he said, rising from his seat. "If there's enough pressure, we might get the hearing we need." She thanked him, watching as he quickly slipped away. While their alliance was tenuous, it was a step forward. At least one sitting official was willing to look deeper into her claims. Back at her office, Jasmine found Naomi sorting through a new stack of letters, physical letters in an age where everything was digital. Most were from people sharing their stories of being ignored or dismissed by local authorities, each letter a testament to the pervasive culture of silence. Some included local media clippings that corroborated their claims of being brushed off or intimidated. Others simply wrote to express that seeing her speak up gave them renewed hope. Jasmine was touched by these gestures, but she also recognized the magnitude of what it would take to address each and every plea. She resolved to build a larger support network, connecting attorneys and advocates who specialized in various issues. The real bombshell dropped when Naomi rushed into Jasmine's office one evening with frantic excitement. "We got a file," she said breathlessly. "From that anonymous source. It's big." Jasmine followed Naomi to a secure computer in a small windowless room at the back of the office. She watched as Naomi opened encrypted documents that contained a series of emails between high-level staffers on the Senate committee. The conversation threads revealed blatant attempts to dismiss or alter official records. In one particularly damning exchange, a staffer explicitly stated that certain documents needed to vanish before any oversight body got wind of them. The language was plain enough to make Jasmine's stomach churn. There was no plausible deniability here. This was evidence of a planned cover-up at the highest level. They spent hours verifying the metadata, the email addresses, and the timestamps to ensure the documents weren't a hoax. Everything seemed legitimate. This was the smoking gun that could force the committee's hand. If any senator tried to spin it as inconclusive, the public wouldn't buy it. The raw cynicism in those emails was too unmistakable. "We need to protect this source," Jasmine murmured to Naomi. "And we need to get these to the right people immediately." She reached out to the supportive senator, hinting at new evidence. He agreed to meet again, this time in a more private setting. Arrangements were made for a late-night rendezvous in a parking garage downtown, clandestine, but necessary. The senator arrived in a discreet black car, stepping out with an anxious look on his face. Jasmine handed him a flash drive containing the emails. She also gave him a printed summary so he could see the scope of the revelations. Under the dim fluorescent lights of the garage, the senator skimmed the documents, his expression shifting from concern to outright disbelief. "If these are genuine," he began. "They are," Jasmine interjected firmly. He nodded slowly, realizing the gravity of the situation. "This changes everything. Even the chair can't ignore this. We'll have to call a special hearing to address these allegations. It's too big to bury." For the first time in days, Jasmine felt a tangible sense of hope. She realized, with a jolt, that events were moving rapidly toward a confrontation that neither she nor the committee leadership could control. And while confrontation was daunting, it was the only path to unearthing the truth. She parted ways with the senator, leaving him to grapple with the political calculus of how to present this evidence in a way that would ensure accountability. She knew powerful forces would soon mobilize to discredit or minimize the documents. But she also knew that once the emails were in official hands, it would be much harder to pretend they didn't exist. That night she hardly slept, consumed by a restless anticipation of the storm about to unfold. She dreaded the smear campaign that might come. But her dread was outweighed by the conviction that the cause was bigger than her reputation. By dawn, she was already awake, watching the sun's early light stretch across her small apartment. She gathered her notes, and prepared for the calls and meetings that would inevitably fill her day. Sure enough, by mid-morning, the supportive senator announced publicly that he had received, concerning evidence, from an undisclosed source and was calling for a special session. The chair's office fired back with a statement questioning the validity of purported evidence from a biased advocate. Predictable. But once the cat was out of the bag, the media wanted more. They pursued Jasmine for interviews, pressed the senator for details, and began dissecting every piece of public information available. Online, the debate raged. Hashtags calling for accountability trended. Political commentators debated the ethical lapses exposed in the leaked emails. Some described it as a defining moment for oversight and transparency, others saw it as partisan theatrics. Through it all, Jasmine maintained a measured presence, opting for cautious statements rather than sensational pronouncements. She wanted the evidence to speak for itself, to outlast any narrative that she was just out for attention. Within a matter of days, the pressure on the chair reached a breaking point. The senator's request for a special session gained traction as multiple members of the committee recognized the political risk of appearing complicit. They scheduled a hearing to examine the documents. Word reached Jasmine that the chair was furious, ranting in closed-door meetings about how one woman with a microphone had disrupted the entire order of things. She took it as a sign that she was on the right track. As the date for the special hearing approached, the city buzzed with anticipation. The building's corridors teemed with press, staffers, and observers from all walks of life. Unlike before, Jasmine was not waiting alone outside the hearing room. She was joined by a growing chorus of supporters and onlookers, each one there because they believed the system owed them answers. A hush fell when the doors opened, and the committee members filed in with somber expressions. It was as though they collectively realized that something bigger than protocol was at stake. This time, no one tried to cut her off. She was asked directly to present what she had discovered. She had no illusions that the chair had suddenly become benevolent. Rather, he had no choice but to appear impartial in the face of overwhelming public scrutiny. With meticulous detail, she laid out the chain of evidence linking the staffers' emails to official records, emphasizing the points where they instructed subordinates to delete or alter documents. As each revelation resonated in the cavernous hearing room, the mood shifted from tension to a kind of collective unease. Senators exchanged looks that ranged from horror to political calculation. Journalists typed furiously, capturing every word. When the chair finally spoke, his voice was subdued. "Ms. Crockett," he began, and there was a crack in the carefully maintained veneer of his authority. "These allegations are serious. If proven, they point to misconduct at levels that cannot be tolerated in this chamber." Jasmine did not relax. She could sense a but lingering in the air. "We will need time to authenticate these emails. Until then, I caution you to refrain from further public speculation." There it was, a warning hidden behind a cloak of fairness. She accepted it politely but knew the public story had already outpaced his ability to contain it. Other committee members took turns questioning her, but it was unlike the previous session. Gone was the blanket dismissal. Instead, they seemed concerned about their own reputations, pressing her for clarifications in a manner that suggested they might actually investigate. She answered each question calmly, grateful for every moment the truth could stand on record. The tension had shifted from her defying them to them trying to manage the fallout of ignoring her. Eventually, she was dismissed so they could question other witnesses in a closed session. As Jasmine stepped out, the corridor exploded with reporters vying for quotes. She repeated her stance. She had supplied the evidence. She trusted the committee to do what was right. But she made sure to add pointedly, "If they fail to act, the evidence will speak for itself." It was a promise and a warning. No matter how the institution tried to spin it, they could not unhear what they had heard or unsee what they had read. Days passed in a blur of speculation. Rumors circulated that the chair was considering resignation if it turned out his staff played a role in the cover-up. Others hinted that certain senators were pressuring him to step down to save the committee's credibility. Meanwhile, Jasmine's name became synonymous with whistleblowing and advocacy. Offers for speaking engagements flooded her inbox, though she turned most down, focusing on the ongoing fight. She received a fair share of hate mail too, vile messages accusing her of fabricating evidence or grandstanding, but she had expected that. It was part of the cost of bringing uncomfortable truths to light. The special hearing continued behind closed doors as the committee subpoenaed staffers, including some implicated by the emails. Word leaked that these interviews were contentious, full of finger-pointing and partial admissions of guilt. Jasmine remained resolute, consistently reminding the public that facts, not personalities, should guide the investigation. In press statements, she kept her tone measured, a reflection of the approach that had gained her respect amid the chaos. Finally, the day arrived when the committee was set to announce its preliminary findings. The hearing room was packed beyond capacity. Senators filed in, some looking fatigued, others stoic. The chair, subdued and uncharacteristically pale, began with a scripted statement. He spoke of institutional integrity, the seriousness of the allegations, and the necessity of a fair review. Then, swallowing hard, he announced that there was sufficient evidence to open a formal inquiry into certain staffers and officials. The hush that followed was absolute, broken only by the rapid clicks of cameras. Though it was not a declaration of guilt, it was a monumental step. Rarely did the Senate investigate itself so openly. Jasmine felt a wave of relief. This was precisely the outcome she'd fought for, an official acknowledgement that wrongdoing might have occurred and a promise of in-depth scrutiny. In the following minutes, the chair tried to salvage some measure of dignity, stating that the inquiry would be thorough and that all parties would have a chance to defend themselves. But the subtext was clear: the situation had spiraled beyond his personal control. The moral echo that Jasmine had ignited could no longer be muted by a single gavel strike. After the announcement, the corridor erupted once more with questions and commentary. Journalists cornered various senators seeking quotes. Jasmine, exhausted yet relieved, stepped outside the building, where a throng of supporters had gathered. They erupted in applause and cheers when they saw her. It was overwhelming. She wasn't used to public adulation. But she recognized the importance of this moment as a collective victory, not just her own. Stepping toward a makeshift podium that someone had placed outside, she spoke briefly, her voice amplified by the hush that fell upon the crowd. She thanked everyone who had contributed evidence, shared their stories, and refused to be silenced. She reminded them that this was just the beginning. An inquiry could be the first step toward real accountability, but it would be a long road. As she spoke, the sun dipped behind the grand facade of the government building, casting elongated shadows on the assembled crowd. By the time she left that day, she was drained, but also imbued with a profound sense of accomplishment. A small seed of justice had been planted within a towering institution known for its resistance to change. It might be nurtured into something meaningful, or it might wither under bureaucracy and political maneuvering. But the truth had broken through the veneer of impenetrable authority, and that, in itself, was monumental. In the weeks that followed, the inquiry commenced in earnest. Subpoenas were issued, and depositions were taken. The evidence Jasmine had brought forward became the centerpiece of the investigation, with the leaked emails forming a roadmap for where to dig. Several committee staffers were placed on administrative leave. The chair, publicly maintaining an air of cooperation, privately fought to contain the damage. But each attempt to clamp down only fueled the public's curiosity and suspicion. More whistleblowers came forward, emboldened by Jasmine's example, adding their voices and documents to the growing pile of incriminating evidence. Media outlets covered every twist and turn, some diving deep into investigative reporting, unearthing further examples of how the committee's oversight responsibilities had been compromised. Jasmine's story became a narrative of perseverance against systemic silence, inspiring others to challenge institutional decay. There were calls for broader reforms, demands that the Senate adopt stricter transparency protocols. Whether or not those demands would translate into legislation was uncertain, but the momentum felt unstoppable. Meanwhile, Jasmine continued to receive messages of support from around the country, from individuals who felt they finally had a champion who wouldn't back down when threatened or dismissed. She also faced the ongoing hate campaign from those who believed the system was best left alone, that rocking the boat only caused chaos. Yet, through it all, she managed to maintain her composure. Sometimes, late at night, she would allow herself a quiet moment to release the tension, tears welling up as she felt the toll of carrying so many people's hopes. But each morning, she rose again, resolute in her mission. Months later, the inquiry concluded with a series of recommendations and referrals for criminal investigation into certain officials. The findings vindicated much of Jasmine's evidence. Though the final report was careful not to implicate the entire committee, it explicitly cited systemic failures and the deliberate obstruction of justice by certain staff members. That, in itself, was a seismic shift for a powerful institution that rarely acknowledged its failings. Multiple resignations followed, and the chair faced censure. Though he retained his position for the time being, his reputation was irreparably damaged. When the official report became public, it spread like wildfire. News anchors spent days dissecting every line. Social media erupted with calls for deeper reforms. In interviews, Jasmine remained humble but firm. "This was never about me. It was about exposing a truth that shouldn't have been hidden in the first place. If this can happen in one corner of government, it can happen elsewhere too. It's up to all of us to stay vigilant." She quickly found that she had become a reluctant symbol of resistance, invited to speak at universities, advocacy conferences, and even international forums about governmental transparency. Despite the accolades, she reminded everyone that the system's capacity to revert to old habits was strong. Permanent change required relentless vigilance. Yet, amid all the public attention, the single most satisfying moment for her came in a simple letter from the older woman whose nephew's case had been buried. Now, thanks to the scrutiny generated by the inquiry, that case was finally being re-examined by higher authorities. Her nephew's complaint was getting a fair hearing, and the letter concluded with, "Thank you for giving us hope again." On a crisp morning when the final wave of media coverage began to subside, Jasmine stood outside the Senate building once more. The massive columns looked the same, stoic and imposing, but she felt a difference in the air. Some intangible shift had occurred in the hearts and minds of the people who worked there. Perhaps it was just the recognition that they could no longer conduct business as usual without fear of exposure. Perhaps it was a new moral awareness, even if grudgingly adopted. Either way, Jasmine Crockett had not been silenced. Instead, Her words had rippled outward, unlocking a vault of hidden truths and rattling the seats of those who clung to power at the expense of justice. She smoothed her jacket, preparing to enter once more. This time it wasn't to testify, but to witness the beginnings of a long-overdue reform process. As she passed through security, she noticed staffers who once regarded her with contempt or annoyance now offering subtle nods of respect. She took her seat in the public gallery, watching as senators introduced measures aimed at increasing transparency in their procedures. The measure wouldn't solve everything overnight, but it was a start, a testament to the power of one individual determined to speak, even when silenced. And in that moment, she recalled the day she had first walked into this building, overshadowed by doubt and intimidation. She smiled softly, remembering the furious gavel strikes, the attempts to quiet her. What she said next had indeed gone viral, but more importantly, it had ignited a movement that continued to grow. Her heart pounded with a renewed sense of purpose. She thought to herself that no matter how daunting the road, she would walk it again and again if it meant the truth would rise, unstoppable, into the light.